Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Stan.
Hello and greetings. We are going to be covering the essay Long Shadows by Arvid Nelson.
The writer of the graphic novel.
1929 was a momentous year. The stock market crashed, fascists were clawing their way to power in Europe, and a Shadow Kingdom, a story by a young writer named Robert Irvin Howard, was published in Weird Tales magazine. Nobody knew it at the time, but Howard had accomplished something visionary, something epic with his first sword and sorcery yarn, and the appeal of his folk mythology has only grown in the intervening decades. Kull wasn't the first fantasy hero. That's a debate I'll steer clear of, but it was the first time someone imagined a fantasy world of savagery and carnage, in stark contrast to the courtly romances of William Morris and the Raphaelites. Kull's tales throb with all the aches of life, with blood, sweat, and grit.
Yeah, very true. Howard's writing is very vivid in a way that almost no other writer has been able to do. Like, it evokes to life imagery and wonder and a savage world unlike any other.
But only two stories featuring Kull as the lead character found publication in Howard's lifetime. On the one retold and expanded on in this volume, and a strange little tale called The Mirrors of Tuzun Thun. Howard took the last Kull story he ever wrote, By This Axe I Rule, and reworked it into The Phoenix on the Sword. In the process, he changed the main character's name from Kull to Conan. The rest, of course, is history. Conan, as we all know it, came to eclipse Kull almost completely. But is it really all history? Conan will always tower over Kull in popular imagination. And yet, in his own way, Kull casts a long shadow over Conan too. He's not a cheap, abortive mirror image of his literary and maybe literal descendant. Kull is one of Robert E. Howard's greatest creations, maybe his greatest, period. I believe he's the closest Howard ever came to writing himself into his stories.
I'm not entirely in agreement with that. I am, in a way, yeah, Kull shares a lot of similarities with Howard. Everybody has commented on that. But in hindsight, I do think there are some key differences.
I'm not the only one to hold Kull in such high regard. John Milius and Oliver Stone created an enduring image of Conan in the 1982 epic film Conan the Barbarian. One of the biggest secrets behind their success is that their story is more about Kull than Conan. For instance, it's Kull who was enslaved in his early years, not Conan. And of course, the film's villain, as well as the shape-shifting serpent people, are Kull's enemies, not Conan's. Whole lines from the film, "Can you summon up demons?" are Kull's. So it's understandable that Conan and Kull have become entangled in people's minds. They share similarities, to be sure. Both are barbarians who become kings of powerful nations by their own hands. But look a little closer and you'll find profound differences. Becoming king is the beginning of the end for Conan. For Kull, it's just the beginning. The reason for this, I think, is quite simple. Kull has insecurities and Conan does not. Reading and rereading The Shadow Kingdom, I couldn't help feeling that Kull's got something to prove. He lacks Conan's self-confidence, and that's part of what attracts me to his character. He doesn't want the crown so much as he needs it. For Kull, his kingship is the ultimate test of his self-worth. Not the proof, but the test. Howard says Kull is a man against a nation.
Alright, so that statement, a man against a nation, is a fascinating sentence right there. And I think only Howard could properly vocalize such a sentiment and feeling. It does perfectly epitomize Kull. He is truly a man against a nation.
The origins of Kull's self-doubt might well be embedded in his past. Kull, after all, has a past. He doesn't suddenly burst into the world like an orgastic firework display, like Conan. What do we really know of Conan's past? Not much, beyond his Sumerian ancestry. But we know a lot about Kull's history. He was raised by tigers in Atlantis. He was a galley slave, an outlaw, a gladiator, a soldier, and finally a king. He doesn't just bounce from place to place like Conan. His life seems to have a vector, a purpose. In fact, if you're looking for Conan's genesis in The Shadow Kingdom, you might just as well look at Brule as at Kull. Brule exhibits many of Conan's qualities. Passionate rapacity, for one. I could steal their girls from under their noses.
Now, this is where I actually think Arvid Nelson is not exactly being very smart. I don't think that we're supposed to look at Brull and think that he's a womanizer like Conan. I didn't get that impression at all from the character. Brull did not seem any more interested in women than Kull did in the original stories. So for Arvid Nelson to say, got this in common because of a throwaway line by Brull. So, this is a really dumb statement. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just really, really dumb. The bit about the past and Conan not having a past, Conan does, so that's also really dumb. So he does make some really smart observations, but he seems a little hurt over the fact that people like Conan more. Which, fair enough. Hey, I think Kull could do with a bit more attention as well. But for one thing, Conan's backstory is, as imagined by Howard, is louder than that of Kull, in that Conan is born on a battlefield, but then spends the next few years quietly with his dad, who was a blacksmith, until essentially Aquilonians come along to hire people and say, hey, want to join the Aquilonian legions? And Conan kind of gets curious about civilization and says, oh, I want to go. But he doesn't join the Aquilonian legions. Instead, he ends up going south and essentially becoming a sellsword, a pirate. He goes from job to job till around his late 20s to about 30 years old, he finally takes the top job of king. He remembers his childhood fascination with Aquilonia and decides, kingship's for me, and ends up somehow claiming the crown after strangling previous king Nemeides on the thrones. As for Brull is someone whom I could steal their girls from under their noses. But I think he was more making a statement about how unobservant the Red Slayers are. Not, I'm such a stud, I could swipe all their girls. No.
He's just saying could.
And I almost took it more as a literal thing where he could kidnap the girl right in front of the Red Slayer and slip right by him without the guy ever noticing him. That's how I always read it. But on the other hand, if you want to read it as him being able to steal the girl in a certain way, which I've also read it that way on other readings, I don't think it means Brull would. The fact that he could doesn't mean he would.
Because he hasn't acted upon it.
This is such a weird comparison to make with Conan.
He snores after he finally reveals himself to Kull. Brull also has Conan's cat burglar-like dexterity.
I object to the term burglar being used to describe anyone other than Bilbo Baggins.
I mean, Conan and Bilbo have nothing in common. I mean, can you imagine Gandalf?
Now that we're talking about it, I kind of wish we got a Bilbo Kull team up. Make that happen, people.
The thought of Gandalf going, I need my burglar, invites Brull. Kull is tethered to the throne, while Brull, like Conan, is free. When Kull and Brull clasp hands in the Shadow Kingdom, after hiding the corpse of the Serpent Man, it's much more than just two men sealing an oath. It's the fusion of the two personalities into what would eventually become Conan.
Yeah, interesting observation, very true. There, Nelson shows himself to be pretty astute.
The differences between Kull and Conan are also reflect landscapes they inhabit. Kull's world, the continent of Thuria, is starkly different from Conan's Hyboria. The Hyborian kingdoms, even mighty Aquilonia, seem shabby and squalid compared to Kull's Felucia. But Conan's world is more alive, more healthy. The civilizations of Kull's world might be grander, but they're also teetering from thousands of years of decadence and rot. While Kull's cities are more civilized, his wilderness is wilder too.
Okay, I'm not sure about that. I don't know where he's drawing that from.
The backcountry isn't a place of freedom for Kull, as it is for Conan. It's a place of danger and death. There are vast swaths of Thuria that are completely unexplored, wherein lurks the pre-human evils of unimaginable horror.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's one of Howard's many strokes of genius that he turned Atlantis, the mythic paradise of Plato, into a brutal, primitive backwater. Even trees fight against Kull in the poem, The King and the Oak.
Well, can you blame them? He was a bit of a douche to them. He didn't even say sorry when he nearly tripped them. I'm being sardonic.
The message is clear. There is no safe place for Kull. The wilderness tests him just as much as his court. Kull's world, like Kull himself, is a place of wild contrasts. While Conan and Kull are different in a lot of ways, those contrasts, those gigantic melancholies, gigantic mirth, are a powerful bond between them. A bond they probably share with their creator.
Okay, I'm actually going to say Kull does not get gigantic mirth.
I don't believe Conan is any less of a philosopher than Kull.
Yeah.
It's just that Conan, and maybe Howard himself by the time he started writing the Conan stories, learned the necessary self-deception to drown out those nagging feelings of emptiness and despair that sometimes attend creative spirits.
Okay, I think with Conan, though, the difference is Conan is very different from Howard in a lot of ways. I think Conan simply has the ability to know in universe how to direct his energies and where to. Conan's always in motion. It's not that Conan has self-deception and he's trying to drown out nagging feelings of emptiness and despair. No, I don't think he exactly has all those feelings of despair and whatnot, because he's pretty content with his lot to a large extent in some of the stories. Although, at the beginning of the Hour of the Dragon, he's not exactly content. He's possibly feeling some hollowness, but on the other hand, how he compensates for it is with always being in motion, always acting militarily, politically, and building bigger than anyone else, pushing the limits, entrenching his authority. He's always in motion so that he doesn't have to deal with those feelings and whatnot.
So Howard's inability to find an audience for Kull in his lifetime clearly isn't because his first barbarian king is any less interesting than his second. Perhaps then it's because Howard was still groping to find his voice as a writer in 1929. And a writer's voice is really just a mask he puts up for self-defense.
That's dumb. No, that's a really dumb statement. Just a mask he puts up for self-defense. Not every writer is like that. Okay, well, let's see. Tolkien's voice was not one of self-defense. Jack London was fascinated by the savagery of nature. Shakespeare was more interested in examining themes of humanity. You've got Walter Scott. This guy seems to think that every character is a self-insert in some way, shape, or form, which is really, really, really dumb. Howard was still groping to find his voice as a writer in 1929. To an extent, but I think that it has to do with the fact that another reason why Kull did not catch on was because, let's be honest, Kull does not have as many cool adventures as Conan. The interesting adventures Conan has are way better than a lot of those that Kull has. Kull has some great ones. I'm going to argue that you could have had some of those styles stories with Kull. The difference is Howard just didn't think of approaching them and preferred to use Conan. But there's plenty of his qualities in his characters. But if you look at, say, Nigel Tranter, for example, his adaptation of Robert the Bruce, is it Nigel Tranter or is it Robert the Bruce? You see what I mean? It's basically a self-insert. No. And a writer's voice is really just a mask he puts up for self-defense. Not always. Yeah, this statement just seems really dumb to me.
Maybe he's projecting his own
views.
Feeling there's a painful biographical quality to the Kull stories. Kull is a philosopher trapped in a warrior's body. Or is he a warrior cursed with a philosopher's insightfulness? He doesn't fit in anywhere, not even in his own skin. He's a king, but he'll never be accepted as such. Not really. Even as the fat Volusian courtiers admire his Atlantean physique, they look down on his brown skin and his hard muscles as the mark of a savage. Kull wasn't any more at home among his own people. The story Exile of Atlantis shows Kull as a kind of person who asks uncomfortable questions and never accepts tradition just for the sake of fitting in. So Kull doesn't find superstitious, barbaric Atlantis any easier than cultured Volusia. Both societies are alien to him. Could there be a better description of Howard himself? In Conan and Kull, he created something no one had ever seen before. But for all his vision and genius, he is a visionary in the derogatory sense, too. He worked outside of and still isn't accepted by the literary academic establishment.
We're going to first unpack the fact that Kull was someone who felt uncomfortable at all times. Yeah, but that I do think there was a source of fascination for Howard, let's be honest. As for Exile of Atlantis, Kull just came from a different background. He was raised by tigers, caused him not to fit in perfectly well with his people. That said, as to Howard not fitting in with the literary and academic establishment, yes, I would argue the literary and academic establishment have, in turn, for example, occasionally there are some who do accept Tolkien, for example, but most reject him. Heck, they reject Mark Twain and deem Mark Twain insane for some weird reason. They genuinely believe he was bonkers, which is very weird. I've seen academics actually reject Shakespeare. The trouble is, literary academics, when I was growing up, I thought, well, they have to be just like Joseph Campbell. They must be brilliant. But then, upon arriving in university, I found that no, most were not very bright. Not many academics, aspiring to be academics, or already academic. Very few were very brilliant. I think that it's a case where literary and academic establishment has not caught up to Mark Twain, Robert E. Howard, Jack London, Tolkien. This might sound weird, but your average person has accepted them. You got to bear in mind, academia is not very smart anymore. There was a time in the 19th century they were very smart, but they usually lag these days about a century or two behind the average people that you run into out on the street or in the restaurant. They're lagging behind the rest of us. I know I sound very snobby and just outright disdainful because I am. I have spent almost half my life in academia. I don't have the highest opinion. History departments, I don't mind. I have a pretty good opinion of a lot of them. But literary departments, they're not very smart. They like to pretend they're smart. They use big words, but at the end of the day, they don't even understand what those big words mean.
And oftentimes those big words mean nothing.
Well, half the time. Howard, they typically don't like and regard him as inferior. Tolkien, some of them try to claim him as one of their own because he was a scholar and he was a professor. The only legacy Tolkien has left is Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and whatnot. I think that there's also a certain amount of envy towards Tolkien on their end. But with Howard, the trouble is, can they even claim him for a second that he was one of their own? No. He ended up saying, I'm smarter than you. I'm an autodidact. I'm self-taught. I'm better read than all of you put together. What do you have to offer me? Nothing. Even Mark Twain was, for the most part, self-taught. And both of them were brilliant men. Actually, the finest writers of the 19th century and of the early 20th century, in a lot of cases, were self-taught and were brilliant men and women, far more brilliant than most professors. So there's a certain amount of jealousy there and even anger. And I think nowhere is it clearer than with Howard because he writes just as well as Tolkien. But the thing is, he's not academic at all in any way.
His writing is raw and uncouth in the best possible way.
I'm actually going to say it's raw, but not uncouth. I think Howard is very refined, but it's a matter that he deliberately is going for raw.
Howard defies classification.
Nelson did classify him earlier. He said Howard created his own folk mythology. I would say Howard's writing is that of most of the writing outside of the fantasy stuff is almost regional or historic fiction. But when it comes to his Cull and Conan, it's very strongly mythological. It's not fantasy, it's mythology. Because it has very little in common with fantasy. It's very mythological.
Like Cull, he spent his life on the borderlands of every place he tried to make his home. If Cull is Howard as Howard actually was, Conan is perhaps Howard as Howard wanted to be.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say that because Cull had never known love, his life as king couldn't have been any better than before. Yeah, we're just going to skip a little ahead because he just rehashes what he said in previous paragraphs.
With Conan, Howard found necessary distance from his alter ego, Cull. It's artifice in every sense of the word. The artifice of a writer better acquainted with his craft.
It basically repeats, Howard has learned to lie to himself. I don't think Howard learned any self-deception. I think it's a matter that Howard actually learned more about himself and about the world around him and people. It's not about learning to lie to himself like Nelson seems obsessed with doing.
And maybe that's why I've always preferred Cull to Conan. I think it's the same reason Cull was never the success for Howard that Conan was. Cull is just too honest with himself, too brutally upfront about the darkness inside of him. In that sense, Cull's tales are not fantasies, they are nightmares. Cull is a thoroughly...
Okay, first off, I'm going to say, that sounds like a lot of copium! Wow! I'm surprised Arvid Nelson didn't OD on that copium. I'm going to be honest. We got to bear in mind, there were 2 stories published. They didn't take. And yeah, they were very honest and raw stories. Howard himself lost faith early on in Cull. Started about half a dozen to a dozen short stories. Gave up on almost all of them except for By This Axe I Rule. And some of the Cull stories were not honestly very good. I'm not going to lie. Howard gave up on a bunch of them because he basically didn't have any faith in them. And he decided to rebrand and repackage. He found himself more interested in Burl as a character, and he wanted to keep some of Cull, and like Nelson noted, he fused the 2 characters into one to an extent, changed a lot about them, such as the backstory, and then brought in a girlfriend of the week, and then decided to explore massive dungeons and basically get into horror adventures like with the Dracula novel in that style. So it's a matter that he refined his craft, and he found that he didn't want to work with Cull anymore. He wanted to move on to a new character. His reasons for liking Cull are interesting, but this seems to have very little to do with Howard. This seems to have more to do with Arvid Nelson as a person.
Cull is a thoroughly modern character. Cull and Conan both have the courage to look into the abyss, but Cull is the only one who doesn't flinch.
What? Okay, this guy is not very bright. No, Conan looks into the abyss and then proceeds to sink his axe into it. Actually, Cull's kind of the character who does flinch from the abyss, but then he wants to look deeper to try to find the answers to life, even as Brill's telling him, you're not going to find all the answers there.
Yeah. He doesn't pretend wine, woman, bloodshed, or power are going to illuminate his darkness.
But neither does Conan. Conan likes his wine, likes his women. Okay, he's a guy with joys life, il a beaucoup de joie de vie. But as for bloodshed and power, those are tools to get ahead and to get what he wants. The difference is, it takes Cull longer to conquer his darkness. Conan conquered it much sooner. But Conan is a very different character. What do I think of Arvid Nelson? Sometimes he makes sharp observations, but even a broken clock can be right twice a day.
I can respect that he's more a Cull fanboy.
But some of his criticism against Conan is just really, really, really dumb.
He's not as bright.
No. Cull's a more modern character. Sounds like Copium to me. No, Cull's not a modern character. You could say he's easier for some people to relate to in the modern age, but I wouldn't say he's a more modern character. In some ways, I think Cull feels more archaic in a way. Feels almost more Roman than Conan, who feels like he dates to the Dark Ages or something.
Yeah, that's an apt description. Because Cull not fitting in a way, he's too civilized for Atlantis, but he's too barbaric for Volusia.
Well, it's because he's supposed to be based off of Emperor Zeno of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Greek Byzantine Empire. Zeno was a barbarian who claimed the crown of Greece, then changed his name and ended up becoming emperor. And Zeno ended up banished from the throne once and then retook the throne, pretty much laying down the groundwork for Greece's golden age under Justinian. Zeno was key, but apparently Zeno was never fully accepted by his subjects because he was a barbarian who took the throne pretty much by force. But Zeno was a very important monarch, and in later generations the Greeks did come to revere him and realize how valuable he was. But Zeno, I think, was supposed to be one of the models for Cull. And you could also see a bit of the Hour of the Dragon story, having story, with exile from the throne and then retaking it after leaving exile. That's Zeno's story. Howard drew some inspiration from that. But anyways, tell us what you think of this video and of this essay, and don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Cull running through a certain serpent man